Hi, Suzanne. It's so wonderful to have you on the Everyday Mystic. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Carissa. I'm looking forward to this conversation together.
Oh, I am too, because I read your book, which just came out, I think it was a month ago, last month.
Even less than a month. Yeah.
How
Yeah. Just a few
exciting.
weeks out. Hmm.
Congratulations on the launch.
Thank you.
I was privy to a pre-release advance copy and devoured that book. It
Oh, cool.
was such a beautiful, heart-wrenching, also soul-affirming read and book that I just loved every word, every chapter, and zipped through that one real quick. But when you read a memoir like that, of course, I feel like I know you in some ways, and certainly with you were so vulnerable with what you shared. So it's wonderful to jump into this conversation, having already had that experience of
Yeah.
you through your writing.
It's interesting, actually. I've heard somebody said to me when I was about a year ago, when I got into the publishing stream and decided I would actually turn this writing I'd done into a book. They said one of the interesting things for you, because I already am a published author, I have a first book that was more my research around women and leadership and case studies, and it's a rich book that's out in the world, but it's not my personal story. And they said, this is going to be really different for you because people are going to meet you and they're going to know you. You're not going to know them, and you have to be prepared for that. And I will say, in the last few months of doing podcasts and then just as the book has started to come out in the last few weeks, I am aware of that's part of what you do in a memoir, which I
Yeah.
is new for me, where you are willing to share your own vulnerable story, knowing that you don't know the other. You're in a conversation, you could say, with whoever's reading your book, and you won't know their story, but you offer it. I'm offering it to the world through the book.
Mhm.
So that's an interesting dynamic right now, um, and one that I can see I've been preparing for, to be able to be that vulnerable, to have this be the offer in the world, as opposed to some of the teaching and research I've done.
How does that feel for you to be in that place, in that vulnerable place?
Well, I think I've probably I should just say for the audience who won't necessarily know some of the, just give a quick sketch here of the moment that led to this second book, You Make Your Path by Walking. I had done 10 years of work in the work that I do with women and the awakening of consciousness and leadership. And I'd written the manuscript with the co-author and was getting ready to bring it out into the world. That was the end of 2012 when I came home to find my husband dead, and dead by suicide. And so the up and out, that was sort of the momentum, you could say, that I was thinking I was on, was not what was happening. Obviously, this was a deep call from uh, the dark forces, the she force. Sometimes I say, the of the underworld. You will come into um, your own depths in a way you never have before. At least that would be the opportunity. And it's not going to be up and out with the flight of the work that I'd already done. So eventually, I got back to publishing that book. That was 2 years later, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that journey, because that's what the second book is about. And so it was many years later, maybe five, from that moment, that traumatic moment when everything changed in my life, when I decided I needed to write myself back together, which is what I did some writing to just write. And then I had collected things and showed it to the editor of the first book, who said, you need to publish this. This could be useful to others. So I give it a little bit of that arc to say, in this moment, to answer your question, it does feel like there's something about, this is my book, there's something about the bringing of this object, let's say, this tangible pearl of great price, because I had to live a very, very difficult journey. Then I wrote about that difficult journey, and then I went through the publishing process to bring it out. It feels like there's a kind of return in the way of the hero or heroine's journey, where there's
Mm.
something that there's some kind of an event that changes, shifts you from whatever world you were in, drops you into the initiation, whatever that is. You slay the dragons or don't, whatever happens, and then ultimately you return.
Mhm.
This is a very long way to answer your very simple question, but it feels like a profound moment to me.
Yeah.
The speaking about this, the offering of my own vulnerable story. It's not how I have taught before, so it's a very different stand for me to I mean, I would share my personal story if I thought it was valuable to the student. It wasn't that I was afraid to do that. It's just that I didn't always think that was valuable. And then, of course, after this tragedy occurred, it took me a while to feel I could really speak to it.
Mm. Oh,
So
yeah.
it is a profound moment, I'd say, for me, in my own journey.
When you've now taught since then of having gone through not only the trauma, grief, and healing process of your husband's death to the writing of the book, and now that you teach and do retreats and do the work that you do out in the world, how has that experience and then the writing of it changed how you show up in those events and in those you do all I call them mysterious woman retreats? Is that what they are?
Right. Well, Mysterious Woman is the enterprise that I founded, and mysterial, as I should just say, is a word that I also invented to describe what I was seeing emerging in women who had done the deep work that we were offering. And I didn't have a word to describe what is that way of being, because I do feel the work that I'm interested in and that we do is about women on the edge of evolution. It's like we are really midwifing ourselves into the next level of consciousness and the way that we show up in the world. And so I think that was, I can see now, and even when this happened, I did surrender to, I worked hard to surrender sooner than later to the devastation that happened to my life. I mean, within 6 months, everything that I knew in the outer world and that my identity was wired around was
Mm.
gone. So my husband, my beloved partner, the future we imagined together, we had an incredible estate on an island that was really a magical world of, my husband David had brought over Indonesian temples, and we had a beautiful Japanese garden. I mean, it really was a magical world, otherworldly place. I let go of my community on that island. So I let go of my business at the time, the way that it was shaped. I mean, really, all the places I anchored my identity needed to be released. And so you in that kind of a situation, first of all, you get to see where you are, where your ego is constructed. The I am a transformational teacher who does this. I am someone who lives on this estate. I am, all of the places that I held on, you could say. It was a profound experience of the truth, I would say, the truth of impermanence. We have some things you tend to think they will go on forever. I certainly did. I could never have imagined anything like this happening to
Yeah.
me. I'd held space for others in their work, but this just was not my life. And initially, I I felt like this. I can't be the leading character in this story. This doesn't make sense. But I would say the shattering of my ego in the way I'm describing. Um, Sometimes I've talked about it like a plexiglass between me and the world, but you don't really see that it's even there until it isn't there, and all of a sudden, your heart is more available. I'd say I am absolutely more present and available with my own broken open heart. Um, I'd say I don't have my identity wired in the same way around what it is I do. I want to be of service and of value, but I've I can walk with anyone through. I was homeless. I had lost my partner. I lost all my resources in his suicide. He really took everything um, with him. So there were so many places or ways that I could have collapsed, you could say, and I didn't. I mean, something else happened for me, and it happened in the fire of the trauma or of the challenge itself. And I suppose that's part of what I want the book to convey,
Mm-hmm.
is that, these aren't easy times to be in right now for any of us, actually, even if you're not going through a real personal trauma. So how to live through those in a way that does allow the breaking open, the cracking open, to be the breaking through to a new way of being, to more of yourself,
Mm-hmm.
really.
Yeah, what I hear you saying is that in the being vulnerable, you're actually stronger and you're
Yeah.
more available to
Yes.
people and you're more available to then the all of the energy that can flood in from others, the beauty, the love, the recognition, even, if that's what we're looking for. But being more vulnerable, which sounds so scary, like, oh, I'm going to take the shell off or remove the plexiglass and step into vulnerability, sounds like that type of exposure would potentially weaken you. I think that's what most people hold in their mindset as or correlate those two. But really, it makes you stronger and more capable and more
Right.
available.
And that's the great experiment, because the small self, you could say, the ego will say, do not do this. This is dangerous. And we learned that when we were younger. It wasn't a mistake in a certain sense. It's part of the process of growing our little identities up in our own development. So, those messages are there. And that's where I think the potency of a situation where unasked for, often, like in my case, certainly unexpected, um, how we meet that the vulnerability is in, it is what I thought I could count on, I can't count on. Like, it's gone. The vulnerability is in being in the present moment, not knowing what's going to unfold in the future.
Mhm.
And actually then, as you were saying, the discovery for me was, that's the place to be. That is the place of power. And that's actually the title of the book, is You Make Your Path by Walking, is to say, it isn't about where the path will take you, so to speak, because we don't know. And often we're only, like, let's say you go through a very difficult circumstance and let me just get through this thing. Let me just survive and get back to something, to my life the way it was before. Um, I just have to get through this, as opposed to, this is actually my life. This devastation, walking over this broken glass, over these hot coals, over this is my life right now. And the more that I can be present, and it takes an enormous amount of vulnerability to do that, because
Mm.
you're not hanging on to the past, and you're not spinning out all the anxieties of the future. You have to keep yourself right here, and then find that the next stone rises up. It really does. Now, I would say I knew this in theory. When I even teach, I teach about being with the mystery. That's where the word mysterial comes from, the capacity to be with uncertainty and ambiguity. But this was like on steroids for me, like,
Mm.
because everything was unknown at the most basic levels of just survival, of, would I have a home, all these various things that Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the bottom of that hierarchy was pretty shaky.
You were
So
knocked
yes,
back down
yeah,
to that.
right, right,
Mm.
and that's right. But what's interesting, or was interesting for me, was the what I call the inner operating system that I had already installed in the work that I do, which is this mysterial way of being. It's it's a consciousness, really, that has to do with having more of our feminine and our masculine strengths available. That operating system I'd already done a lot of work with this, but it got deeply installed, maybe embodied is a better word to get out of the computer metaphor, in the midst of the challenge.
Mm.
And that's the opportunity. But often, as I said, we see these things that are happening to us and we don't see them as something we can grow through, which is not the same. And I want to really make the distinction with the spiritual bypass, because I have a very deep and long time spiritual path. And I was absolutely committed to not doing the bypass of, oh, it's all okay. This is what's meant to be in life, I guess, or it's a gift, or, and not be in the body and not process the feelings and not be really in the relational dynamic with everybody else that was there.
Mhm.
Um, that was a big commitment for me to do that, to be really the transformative force by coming down and into my own body.
Mhm. Let's talk about spiritual bypassing more because I think that's a very common trap that people can get caught in when exploring their spirituality and then seeing themselves beyond the physical. They can kind of quickly go to this set of practices or a way of even just using the words to talk about the things that then mentally bring them there, but don't they don't carry the heart with it, or they don't carry like it doesn't carry the rest of you into that space. It's just like, oh, we can talk these words and throw around these concepts, and it can become very damaging to people who then take their spiritually bypassed self and then pass that along as a spiritually enlightened person to then follow, right? So then it
Right.
just gets passed along to others who may fall within the same trap that that teacher, guide, mentor, healer may be under. And I don't think it's necessarily with malevolence that that happens. It's just it's kind of a uh, just a common maybe happening among people who are exploring this path. So share with me your experience, because you said that this is something you've very consciously avoided in your life. But I know that in reading your book, your husband fell prey to this type of bypass to some degree. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, you are. This is my interpretation. Of course, I don't 100% know, but he had, I think, two big factors came in. One, he had tinnitus, so the sort of screaming sound in the ears, in the head, that there is no cure for at this point. I mean, so it is very, very difficult to live with. So not getting all the sleep that he would normally get, but also he couldn't get into these very high states that he would get into in meditation, where he'd be able to sort of transcend his problems and his issues, and he couldn't do that. He had, because of the long time spiritual practice, he had a kind of certainty about other dimensions of reality, and he felt a really strong sense of free will, like I can be here or not be here. I can go over to the other side, and I do feel that he now I can say I just don't think he had the strength. And it's what he wrote me actually in his letter. He did not have the strength to stay and deal with what was about to happen, which was his business was about to come crashing down, and his whole financial world that was tied into our property. And he had a very separate business from me and the work I was doing with women and leadership. He didn't have the desire to face that, and just could leave. You could say that was the ultimate spiritual bypass, is you take yourself out of this and the suffering of this world. There's too much suffering, and I don't want to be in the body. So initially you could say, so that I think was a part of David's leaving and how he left. And yes, so I was not going to do that. I chose to stay in my body and actually in the middle of this, handling all the things that he could not handle, as it turned out, and have that be, as I said before, the fire of my own awakening. But it meant, it still means, um, the identity in a certain sense that this happened to, which was 10 years ago now, was not the identity, certainly not the identity I have now, but not the identity that could forgive David or that could um, make my path in the way that I was going to need to make it. In other words, the identity that shattered needed to shatter. And one part of that was my ability to get into high states of meditation, which I still find very useful. It's not that it isn't useful to differentiate from the world of, you could say, the contents of consciousness, with what we're saying, to actually rest more into a field of awareness that's outside of the day to day. But like your podcast says, the everyday mystic, my work has also been, I'm very interested in how we wake up in the world. We grow ourselves up, because that's what I think is happening. This evolutionary moment is asking us to grow capacities we've never had before as humans, and then really show up in the world in certain ways, like be here in the body. But for that to happen, yeah, you got to let go of the ways you've stopped from being here.
Wow, what a profound lesson and way to be taught to come back into your body and face these things that weren't even yours, but I guess they were yours from a spiritual or
Right.
soul journeys standpoint, right? Your gauntlets to run and for
Well, the
you to
moment,
learn that.
yeah, I would say, my view is we have different probability paths in our lives. You know, things can unfold in different directions. Um, and the moment David made the decision and left the way that he left, that was one probability path. I don't think he came in. I don't think beings come in with a plan to suicide. I don't, that's not my understanding. Things can happen where that's one of the options, and that is what he did. But the moment he did
Yeah.
that, that changed the trajectory, obviously, of my life profoundly. And
Mhm.
so, you know, that moment, and then the days and months following that, to really keep getting myself on this new, no path. There was no path, but let's just say off of this path that had a
Mhm.
clear, you know, I was about to launch a program that we hadn't run for a year. I was about to bring a book into the world. I was about to host a wedding, you know, or be involved in a wedding that David had brought together his niece and the son of his best friend. You know, there were all these things that were a path and then gone. So the the job, and my job initially, the only real thing was to just keep, I want to say, waking down, or coming home, coming into the reality of what is. Because as I said before, that is the ground, that is the only solid ground in a situation like I had. There was no solid ground in terms of
Mhm.
where I could go next. But being here now, that thing we say so, you know, lightly out there, that was everything, because the more present I could be, which meant accepting the horror of the situation, the more ground I had under me, the more I could see the next thing I needed to do, the next step I
Mhm.
had to take, the next
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah. I thank you for bringing that up, that, we're really living in this world of infinite possibilities and probability, right? Of whatever could happen, and every choice that you made then in response to and in the wake of his death, also then shaped what the ripples that you had around you as well, of how other people respond. I mean, we are, it's fascinating how, we have all of this free will to choose whatever our next step is going to be, whatever our unfolding. And I think that's an important thing for people to remember, that we have this power and ability to choose these infinite paths, not just be subject to or victim to something that happens here in this 3D place, that we're then responding to. And it seems so like that this is so the reality, but the reality is actually quite different when you start to work on these different levels, or just even experience life from those planes. So for you, you already knew how to work in these ways. You were working in these ways. You developed your own programs and content, and had taught countless women already to move through these. And what I read in your story is that you really got to put that to the test for yourself, to actually walk through the everything that you had created and put out into the world, to actually be initiated into it in a very profound way. Um, and I would imagine that has deepened and strengthened
Yeah.
every single one of those teachings and offerings that you had developed.
Absolutely. I feel the first book, The Way of the Mysterial Woman, what we uncovered, and that was after 10 years of work with hundreds of women in our university women's leadership programs. I'd say I'm not going to say invented, I'm going to say more like an anthropologist dusts something off and you can see it. We discovered an archetypal pathway, basically, that different feminine and masculine archetypes that light up in a women's path from when born up into the later years. That's also true for men, but just the work that we did was with women. Partly because we could see that the feminine impulse that was trying to come in now, in culture, has a feminine essence to it, because we've been 5,000 years inside a more masculine paradigm of wholeness, and the feminine just simply needs to come in now. We need that. We need that to come in, and so this pathway, I'd say, was a kind of download. It was a download, and I understood it to a certain extent, and I had been already we discovered enough, and there'd been profound enough sort of alchemical changes in our students and women that we wanted to write a book about it. So that still feels very accurate to me. The pathway feels very accurate, but I do feel when this call came, this shattering, I feel it was an invitation, if I would receive it, and I did receive it, to find out what was really true. Everything mattered for me at the most personal level. And I tended to be very transpersonal. I've since I was very young, I had a very early spiritual experiences. I am very interested. I feel like I'm here as a soul in this lifetime to be a guiding force to help others wake up to more of who they are, and of the great wave of our beautiful nature, let's say being nature or consciousness unfolding. I've always felt that, and I feel the transpersonal part of that. But sometimes I could forget the personal part, and I did forget the personal part. And this shattering brought me right back, because at a very personal level, everything mattered. The stakes were enormously high. It's one thing to be speaking inspirationally about taking risks and changing when you live in a multi-million-dollar estate with your partner, with all the things that I had around me. it's another thing to find that is still true, to be able to own that experience of something larger, be embedded in and in a larger field of belonging when you've also taken yourself into account. And that was really important to me. So I'd say I deeply embodied what I downloaded before, but I
Mhm.
really took it back in and said, is this still true? Is this still true that the mother archetype lives like this in me and that I need to cultivate it this way? Is this still true that the hero, the masculine flame, and how do I experience that or not? And, all the way through the sequence of archetypes. So I'd say they got upgraded. What I knew before got upgraded through my lived experience. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Although the pathway is the same.
Mhm. Yeah. Did in your healing process and in the evolution of that upgrade, did you find yourself back in the past discovering any childhood traumas or anything that you had not dealt with prior to that came up to the surface?
Absolutely. Yeah. I would say I wrote a little bit about this in the book. Um, but one of the things that it took me about a year of just all of the processes that I had to be involved in that year, which I write about in the book, to then say, okay, I have the bandwidth now to do my own shadow work here. Like, what happened and what do I want to be able to see, since everything got exploded open and I never want to ever have to go through anything like this again. What might I be able to see now that I couldn't see before? By shadow, I mean parts of myself that I hadn't had a relationship with. That's both the golden shadow, my own strengths, and also you could say the negative shadow, or parts of myself I learned to put in the dark, but don't own and can project them out on others. So I found someone to work with who worked in a similar way to me, because I definitely needed someone to be. That is the work I do. That's the shadow work is the work I do with women, to help them see the parts of themselves that they tucked away in order to get love, safety, and belonging when younger, and get that energy back in the system again. And so in that holding, I was able to, um, really turn toward parts of myself that was humbling to see to really acknowledge my own, uh, yeah. For example, I'll just say, and this is where it taps into the family of origin, because, there's the, the trauma of today is going to open the doorway to earlier traumas. There's just no way that won't happen. And the opportunity then is to say, okay, what is that earlier piece? There's something from the earlier trauma. And I had done a lot of work with other things that hadn't been fully integrated yet. Um, and the one I feel to talk about this morning, and I don't know why, but of all of those, is my mother died when I was quite young. And in fact, I was just about to turn 30, right before my Saturn return, or in my Saturn return time. And it was very tragic and very sudden. And she was ripped out of my life for the heart attack. And very similar to David. And interestingly, that was also my Saturn return, but my second
Mm.
return. Um, and those were my two where I really felt like my field of belonging, like I belonged with my mother. I've felt that belonging since I was very little. And it's similarly with David. There was a healing in my sense of, finally home. I've met this person where I just feel I'm so home. And so there was something for me to reclaim there, because both of these were so sudden. My mother's death was so sudden, and I was not equipped to be in my body the way I was with David. And so I really did some work on that. Like, I really was able to grieve in a way I hadn't fully her loss.
Mhm.
um, and and also in a certain sense get anchored in my body, that sense of belonging that was wired to the two of them, but isn't just about with them. In other words, if I could feel that, I can be at home in myself and belong in a larger pattern. And that was a big insight for me. It continues where I feel I don't need in the same way the personal. I do, of course, still want the personal belonging, and I have a partner, and I love to belong in that relationship now and with my friends. But my own identity is sort of at home in a larger field of belonging, and
Mm.
that I was able to do, like an earlier trauma in the moment. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge shift in energy from a place of lack, right? That you only can get your belonging from out here versus, oh, we're in a shared belongingness together
yeah.
that
A
you can
wider
be.
penetrating field, um, a friendly universe, you could say.
Yeah.
And that was essential for me because so many synchronous things and signs and uh, were came, but I had to be available for them. Like there were just so many gifts I could say from outside that were offered to me, um, because I was in a field, because I was willing to be actually in the center of this field and receptive. This is the receptive feminine, I think. It wasn't about me just powering through in my masculine. I did need some of that energy. Of course, I had there was things I had to do, but equally important was the receptive feminine, to really be open to the people coming in close, to be the one that did need the holding and the healing, and also to be paying attention to what was happening around me.
Mhm. I so appreciated that aspect of your story of the opening and being again vulnerable and receptive to the gift offerings from your friends and your community during that period. And I thought of a friend of mine who is going through a really hard time right now, who has a huge she's let's say more similar to you than not similar to you, meaning, she's a well-resourced person, um, has, she knows and has so many friends, tons of people in her community that could be supporting her, that could be helping her. And yet, the one factor that is preventing that is that willingness to be open and vulnerable and receptive. Uh, and therefore,
Right,
all of that energy that wants to come in and help
right.
it doesn't have anywhere to go.
And so that would be a great example of, because I've worked with many women like that in my programs as well. That would be a great example of a young self, an adaptive child. And I would say it's not wrong. We learn how to do this in order to get love, safety, and belonging. Who learn to wire together an independent self that could take care of things on her own and make her way in the world. And it probably kept her safe. It
Yeah.
probably was very, very helpful. But what fires together wires together. And that's the hard thing, because then as a older person, as we develop, that starts to become a limitation. That adaptive child is driving the car still when actually it's no longer appropriate. You can't see over the dashboard, and
Right.
in the complex life, that she has, for example. So that was for sure the opportunity for me, that part of me that I didn't even know the places I wasn't receptive until it was in, all there trying to come in. And I realized you have to really get into this receptive feminine quality. You have to, for the sake of the whole pattern, for your own sake. I mean, I needed it, but also I was in the middle of a, trauma zone with all the people around us and his family. And, everybody was suffering. And so the receptive piece here was essential. So what sometimes for someone like that, it takes, um, giving permission, almost recognizing the suffering that's going on that makes it impossible to let someone help you. Like,
Mm.
wow, that you must be so afraid of what would happen if you opened that door just a little bit to let something in, right? Because then the whole everything's going to flood in, and this was a young child psyche here, and wipe you out. But maybe that's not true. Maybe you could just let in a little bit and see how that feels, and test it out, see what happens. Does everything fall apart? Are you not appreciated and respected? And what actually happens? Like, invite your friend, and probably maybe
Mhm.
you've done this, but 2% at a time is something I always say. Like, don't
Mm.
throw the door wide open and get everybody in,
Yeah.
because if she's doing that, there's been a good reason for that.
Hmm. Right. And it is so true that all of these, what we might call a maladaptive behavior, was a perfectly it was the best strategy at the time, right? Or at a time. Otherwise, we wouldn't have done it.
Mhm.
Otherwise, we wouldn't have learned it. But it's that, just like you said, it's that becoming of a pattern that you never evolve from, or grow from, or learn from, that, and we get stuck in that age, as you said, or stuck in that time, or just reliving that story over and over, is the tragedy of it. And so let's talk a little bit about, what do you think it is then within someone who, we can put words on it, like resilience, or um, some type of spiritual knowing, maybe, or what do you think it is within someone who, and we can even, talk about it in the frame of your own story, who says yes to the receptivity, says yes to the next stage of their evolution, and someone who just crumbles beneath that, and can't face that,
Mhm.
like your David. I mean, that would be right. You two faced what you had in your now in two very different
So
ways.
anyway,
Yeah. So, have you thought of that from a transpersonal kind of universal sense, what it might be within someone that is able to persevere, be resilient?
yeah. Well, hmm, I don't feel it's innate. In other words, I don't feel some people have the lucky gene that lets them be in the midst of trauma with resilience, and some people don't. I don't think that's the way it is. Um, but I do feel there's something about how this is where, in the work that I do, for example, um, is to help women install this new operating system. I mean, basically, have that a way of being in relationship with themselves and others in the world that equips them to handle what arises. So that can be cultivated over time, where you're in practices, where you have your own container. One of the things I teach is morning practices, and the importance of having those, so you actually have yourself before you go into whatever's going to arise during the day. You are in relationship with yourself. So there are certain things that you can cultivate that will help you, that definitely help you be with what is. But then I think there is what can be cultivated in the difficult circumstances. I mean, it's almost like an accelerator. So if you don't have that already in place, then the most important, like the first step, really is the self-compassion, to come to be kind to yourself, gentle to yourself. You are right now in the middle of a very difficult situation, and and being able to turn toward yourself is the first thing you can do, not as the victim, but as the healthy mother, you could say, saying, whoa, this is, and I must say that that's one of the practices we teach is self-compassion and the ability to be really gentle with oneself. And so that is essential. And then the second thing would be what we just talked about relative to your friend, to have an ally or allies. When you fall apart, you need somebody around you, a resonant field, because we're like little tuning forks. We always tune to what's around us. And when you fall apart, if you're just around other people that are saying you're a victim and saying it's, blaming the person and taking all of your power and giving it to the circumstance, basically, then that's what you're going to tune to. So find a friend who's got holding a different space for you, can hold you in the suffering that's a part of the loss of something you've known, but not the suffering of the suffering, which is a kind of Buddhist expression of where I'm suffering, but then I'm making it worse by holding myself in that victim position. I mean, I knew from the beginning there was going to be enough suffering in this to not suffer the suffering. Like there was just going to be enough suffering to not make myself a victim. And I think those are the two keys to lift yourself out of that place. One's tenderness with the self, and then having an ally. And then, and here's the thing that I think is remarkable, is you can cultivate this resilience in the heat of the flame. It's the thing you make your path by walking. You can become, I certainly feel I became much more resilient through what I was able to build in myself than I was before.
And the title of your book is such a beautiful metaphor, but also I guess, a powerful spell as well to share with the world, which I really agree with. And this subject came up on a prior recording I did with a guest as we were talking about, well, what's next on their path, and we just kind of, we got into the philosophical discussion of, how does the path unfold, and how does this, is it divined or destined, or is it through each step? And for me, that understanding is what you've shared in your book and in your life, of that every step we take divines the next step. It is just like you were saying with the probabilities, like, well, that happening, and then you could have gone in a million different directions with the response to that very profound life event happening. And we all have that, right? Every single day.
Absolutely.
We have that capacity and that opportunity to take this step or that step or the millions of other steps forward. And the one that we take then creates the path, versus that it already exists and you have to find it somewhere.
Right.
Because that can seem, a bit daunting for people, rather than,
Right.
oh no, actually you just take your next step and then your next step. And then when obviously you start to really tune into the inner self and into your inner guidance and into forces maybe beyond just what we might think of as more limited on the physical plane, like then you can actually be guided and led and know through trusting of the intuition that, ooh, okay, I'm being guided to this step, and ooh, okay, it proved to be the right thing, and I'm going to trust that more and go this way. So it's not blindly just taking the next step and seeing what happens when
Absolutely
you
not.
start to really tune in, right?
Well, I call that, actually, that's a capacity I call unfolding the emergent, which is a way to describe what you're just saying, which is there is something trying to unfold, but it's a very different thing than making stuff happen, right? That's a different energy. Unfolding the emergent is I need my masculine and my feminine. So I am paying attention to I may have a goal, I may have a clear objective, and and in fact, I feel strongly that there's a potency to that holding of a clear intention of what you would like. But how you get there, that is another thing, But having almost like you're on belay in the climbing metaphor, you've got a rope out to your future self on the many probability paths. You want that future self that. So let's say back when everything fell apart for me, I was already connecting with this future self I am here today. Like this future self. I was finding her and seeing what that future could look like, and having that energetic connection on we could say that destiny line. But how it would unfold is another thing, and that's where then you need to unfold the emergent. And of course, if you're in your body, you start to learn, and these are some of the feminine skills I think we need to cultivate along with our beautiful rational brain. Has to do with our intuition and our body knowing, and how to read signs and signals and things coming from the field around you to give you a sense of where to tune yourself, like how to move. And then when it's not really clear and you don't know, maybe it's not the time to make a step. Is that okay too? Because very often I found when I didn't have if there wasn't quite enough clarity. I mean, many steps I took, I had no sense of how it would work out. I'm not saying you know how to work out. It's just that I knew this was the next thing. But sometimes I knew I didn't know enough yet. Like it wasn't ripe in my body, let's say. And sure enough, 2 days later, maybe the next piece of information came in that would determine what I needed to do. So that's a lot of what we teach in the work that I do is with women, is how to actually get this vehicle. This is the upgraded operating system, because I would say these are initiatory times. We could say on the planet, we are not equipped for that. We've lost a lot of the rites of passage in our Western world. And when life gives you a shaking up of some kind, where you're being shaken out of your comfort zone, it would be a really different thing if you could see it as a rite of passage rather than this real inconvenience that I got to get back to where I'm going. Like, we need to be shaken up. We are in a mutative time on the planet, and I think we are being invited to transform ourselves into this next level of the expression of what it is to be a Homo sapien. And some of us are on that edge, and we're going to get the wake-up calls. We are. I mean, I can speak to my own. They don't need to be that harsh. I hope they're not for people. But when one comes for you, the invitation, of course, is to open to it. Let it be the transformative fire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, let it be, and step into the fire. Having tools like yours through the courses and offerings and retreats, but certainly just in reading your book, which is a very low point of entry for people as far as learning so much about the meta-capacities that you had already developed, but then that you actually lived through and experienced and put to test within your in the wake of David's suicide. It's the weaving together of the work and your life in that way was so profound. And so I urge everyone to pick up Suzanne's book, because it's not just a memoir of her story. We were reading about this thing that happened. It's an actual guide book to your own unfolding and your own capacities, what she's deemed these meta capacities that are in there. And so there's a beautiful process that you can go through. You're invited to go through, at least within the reading of the book. You don't have to, but you're invited into that process if you wish. And for those of you who find this curious, pick up her book. It's a really, like I said, a low cost entry way into learning these deeper mysteries and stepping into those for yourself. And of course, you've got your other book, Mysterious Woman, as well, that
Right.
people could
The
dive
Way of the Mysterial
into.
Woman, Upgrading How You Live, Love, and Lead. That's, I think a lot of people have found when they read this new book, at least I've been hearing this, the new book in a sense points toward these meta-capacities you're talking about, which was interesting because at the end of the first book, we had just started to see these meta-capacities arising in women that had done our work. And when I started to write the second book, I was wondering how to hook it into the first book so it could be some kind of a guidebook, but couldn't quite figure it out because I was using all the archetypes. And then I went back to that chapter and it was like, oh, that's what I did. Because we had, and in the first book I wrote, we're just starting to see these. Please let us know what you're finding out. We're just discovering, what does multidimensional knowing mean? What does it mean to tend the field? What does it mean to embrace paradox? And so it was really a profound thing for me to see the connection. But when people read the second book, then they are often very interested in getting the building blocks. And the first book has a lot of practices and case studies so people can really see the transformation in other people besides myself.
Yeah, I'll look forward to reading the second book, which is your first book, and being led back to that. Thank you so much for spending time with us. Thank you for opening up and being vulnerable in the world with your story and sharing your story in service of others, which
Mm-mm.
it very much feels like. And I know, I'm sure it was cathartic and healing for you to write it, but it is as much so for the reader. At
I'm
least me
so
as
happy
a
to hear
reader,
that.
I can say I experienced that.
Thank you, Carissa. I just love hearing, I really take in to my heart your words, because it was absolutely a labor of love, to take my experience and translate it so it could move out into the world. And I'm
Mm.
really happy to hear it was received that way.
Thank you so much. I'll put all of the links to your work and your books in the show notes, and we'll look forward to another conversation and an ongoing one with you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Suzanne.